that, would like to ask David, who has been an educator for a long time, starting as a teacher in elementary school, but making it to the dean of the Berkeley School of Education. Lots and lots of experience in education, and particularly also with reading. And you have a new program and curriculum, Seeds of Science and Roots of Reading. And in that sense, you already combined two of the words that are important here. And I'd like to reflect a little bit about this importance for young children to begin.
Absolutely. But before I do, can I make a connection with something that Steve said? And you mentioned the migration out of the science pipeline early in students' college careers. We have a program at Berkeley, and the other UC campuses have it too. And it was originally inspired by a program at UT Austin. And it's to try to get some of those students who, in their first few courses, decide that they don't want to be career scientists, but they love science and we want to inspire them to seek careers as science teachers. Because as you know, one of the biggest problems we have in the United States is the pipeline of math and science teachers. So we think that many of those students would like to stay in science if they can find a career that allows them to sort of wed their science interest with some of their social science dispositions and their artistic sensibilities, which are, as you all know, are a core part of being a teacher. So, we're hoping that proves to be a viable alternative for some of those students. But and one other thing, I have to connect with something that Carol said, and Carol, I think it's only Riff that could come to the rescue and put some steam back in STEM. I think that's an appropriate role for reading as fundamental. But back to Martin's question, I am thrilled to have, over the last 7 or 8 years, have made a connection with my colleagues up at Lawrence Hall of Science on the Seeds of Science, Roots of Reading program. And basically the logic is simple. For all too long, if you go back to the 70s, the problem with science is that it was textbook driven, and my colleagues in science education felt as though literacy was the enemy, that reading and writing, particularly in the form of textbooks, had stripped science of all its inquiry and all its creativity, and science was a received curriculum. It's there in the textbook for you to, learn, and that's just it. So if it wasn't in the textbook, by the way, it was probably delivered by lecture, but there wasn't any sense of inquiry, of hands-on science and the like. That led to the 80s and the 90s with the proliferation of all the NSF inquiry-based curricula. And those were great, except they specifically tried to downplay the role that reading and writing played in favor of inquiry. And I think what we're discovering, and you mentioned it with the new generation science standards, they're all about reinfusing language and literacy into science. Why? Because not only is it that do you need it for communication, no scientist can do his or her work without literacy. And so what we've done in Seeds of Science, Roots of Reading is to start with our youngest learners. We started out in grades 2 through 5, and now we're into the middle school, which is a whole other issue, which I'll talk about sometime. And then once we work our way through that, we're going to go down to the real challenge, which is K1. And how do you hook up reading and writing with science in those early grades? But the logic of our curriculum is, how do you transform the enemies of science, the textbook-driven curriculum? How do you transform reading and writing into tools that enhance both the acquisition of knowledge and the development of science inquiry? And so we reconceptualize reading and writing as tools. Not as goals, but as tools. And we use books to help you do your inquiry science better. And we use writing to help you do your inquiry science better. And our inspiration for that is looking at the ways that real scientists use literacy in their lives and in their work. And of course, every living, breathing scientist spends as much time reading and writing about science as they do out in their labs doing it. You don't discover everything in a vacuum. You can learn from others through books and things like that. So what we tried to do is to figure out the roles that text can play, and we found 5 of them that are really significant. One, of course, is to provide content. There's lots of knowledge that's been accumulated, and books are a medium through which you can communicate that. But another one is providing context, and that is, and by context I mean connecting with the traditions within which you work as a scientist, whether you're a life scientist or a physical scientist or whatever, but also connecting with the context of everyday life and how science influences the quality of our everyday lives. So for example, in a unit on shoreline science, we have a book called Black Tide. And what do you think the Black Tide is about? That's right, it's a sort of a newspaper account of the various stages of the Exxon Valdez disaster. And so that's what I mean by providing a context for your work. We find that books are great at providing models of key science processes. And it can either be a depiction of a process, or better yet, we have, for every unit we have a bio-sketch of a living, working scientist. So you can go meet Gary Griggs, the sand scientist who works at University of California, Santa Cruz. He's a hero, by the way, because he started out his career as a surfer, so all the kids love reading about Gary. Or we have a bio-sketch on the guy, and I'm blanking on his name. He's the guy who figures out the new flavors for Jelly Bellies in the Jelly Belly factory. And he's a popular one too, and the like. But they're not just cute stories. They provide real, living, working models of what scientists do. And we have books also about literacy processes. We have a book called My Sea Otter Report, which is all about the story of a third-grade boy who has to write a report, and so he gets advice from the expert in the family, his fifth-grade sister, about how to write a report. And it's a very cute story, but you end up with a model of what it means to write a scientific report, and to take care of all the parts and the processes and the like. And we also have books that depict what we call secondhand inquiries. So if you're doing a terrarium unit, you might read about another class somewhere else in the country that did its own terrarium unit. And why is that good? Because you can compare your results with the results of the other group, just like every scientist has to situate his or her findings where, in comparison to the kinds of findings that have gone on before and the like. We also have books that help you do first-hand inquiry. Just like I remember when I took high school chemistry, I had that big fat handbook of chemical, whatever it was, of chemical elements and stuff like that. For every unit, we have a handbook. The handbook of shoreline organisms, the handbook of interesting ingredients, and so forth and so on. So what we try to do is to model all the ways in which print media and writing processes. So now we have kids keep journals, just like scientists do. We have them write about their work. We have them share their work in exactly the way that living, working scientists do. So we really try to take the authentic kinds of literacy that are part and parcel of science and turn those into tools to enhance the goals of science. So that's what we're really about.
So I hear that you use reading and writing and language as a tool to learn science, but at the same time, it also sounds like you use science as a context within to learn.
Absolutely.
Reading and writing and use your language and so on and so forth.
Well, we're very, very careful to document both the kind of science learning that occurs as well as the literacy learning that occurs. And what we find is that just as literacy helps kids acquire more knowledge and better inquiry skills in science, so the context of science sharpens kids' literacy skills, particularly their writing, but also their oral language, because science is all about discourse, and it's all about talk, and it's all about learning the language of each of the kinds of science you do. And there's no better way to and by the way, it's also about argumentation, of course, and creating arguments and making claims and using evidence to support those arguments, which is part and parcel of literacy too.
But David just mentioned 4 of the science practices that we have in our framework already embedded into what you just answered, which is quite interesting. But I want to come back then to if reading, writing, language is a tool for science learning and vice versa, where does art play?
I thought about that a lot, and because it hasn't been an explicit goal of ours to sort of promote the artistic sensibilities. We've really taken on the scientific sensibilities. But as I was thinking about it, two things occurred to me. One of which is that the ultimate goal of art and the ultimate goal of science are really the same, and that is to develop insight into and knowledge about the nature of existence and how the world works. And they're really both about investigating and representing the world around us. And so deep down, I think there is this fundamental kind of union between art and science. And so that's one kind of thing. And I think that Steve mentioned the creativity. Creativity is also a common core. If scientists didn't ask their version of what if questions the way that all artists are, art is about asking what if, right? It really is. When you think about what it is that artists do, they escape the bounds of the normal logic of representation to challenge us to think about the things in new and different ways. And I think that the science breakthroughs have that same sort of feel to them. But at a more practical level, in Seeds and Roots, we have a mantra. It's called read it, write it, talk it, do it. Anything that's worth doing in science is worth representing in those four media. So if you learn a new word, we want you to encounter it in reading, we want you to use it in writing, we want you to use it when you talk science, and we want you to use it when you're doing science. And by the way, that bond that you get between the vocabulary of science when you're doing it is so much stronger than if you're just talking about it. The doing it really matters. But I thought about that, and we also do it. I never thought about this before. We also do not only read it, write it, talk it, do it. We also do draw it, photograph it, represent it, and the whole idea of using a representation of things to understand them better is very much a part and parcel of that. And then I thought, isn't that what those guys in the 17th century were up to when they went out and tried to represent the natural world and all the botanicals that they drew with the line?
No, I'm an original botanist by training, and I know that you couldn't be a good botanist unless you could draw what you saw at the microscope when you looked at the structures. And they wouldn't allow you to just take a representation that you photograph because you were already abstracting when you did that. But that's a different story.
So I'm thinking of incorporating draw it into our mantra.
Yeah.
So, right.
Before I get to Judy, I want to transition between the two of you by asking the question. So this is great, and I have a 2-year-old, and I know how important it is to take books that are artful and that combine what its interests are across all sorts of domains. But what does it really look like if you come from a background that is not privileged, that is difficult in terms of its socioeconomic setting, and that is difficult in terms of what happens outside of schools and in the summer and all this kind of thing. So, I mean, this is really a question. This all sounds fantastic, but I can see already that it requires a lot of investments, a lot of creativity by the educator and the parents and what have you. What does it mean if you don't have that?
Well, you're really talking about the achievement gap between rich and poor in this country, and it's an inescapable fact. It's there, and the real problem in American education is not that we've gone to hell in a handbasket over the last 30 years, because if you look at the NAEP scores, they're pretty, we closed the gap for 20 years and we kept it pretty stable for 20 years. The real problem in American education is that we haven't been able to close that gap, that it's still there, despite so many incredibly sincere and arduous efforts to close it. But I actually, one of the reasons I work at the Science Literacy Interface is that I have this hunch, and it's not just a gut level feeling. It's actually based upon some analysis of the difference between the haves and the have-nots. The gap in language, at least, in science, is narrower than the gap, let's say, when it comes to literature and things like that. That is, the kids who are usually ahead of the curve aren't as far ahead in science, because in some ways, when it comes to learning science, we're all English learners, because we don't know much of the language of science. And so I view science as a medium, as a context in which we can really do right by the educational have-nots, which usually are poor and minority, and especially linguistic minority kids. And so I view that as a place where they can acquire knowledge, vocabulary, and language all at the same time. And I think it's a perfect context for really enhancing the skills and opportunities for English learners. So that's one of the reasons that I choose intentionally to work in the area of science and literacy.